well. I hope you're doing well, given the end of the year is upon us and the spirit of the season calls us all to be reflective. I thought I'd do my own version of reading superlatives and reflecting through my year through literature. So without further ado, we'll start with the best book that I read this year, which is none other than Night Sky with Exit Wounds by Ocean Vuong. It is one of the most compassionate literary experience that I've experienced in my short life so far. Vuong's writing is visually decadent and each word is carefully tended to with intention. It's a love letter to love and survival, I think, especially the kind of love where it is not just an insular experience, but rather one that welcomes life, the aftermath of survival, your quest to survival into the table with you. I think it's a theme that is also carried further in On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, which I also read right after I finished the book Hangover from Night Sky of Exit Wounds. The collection speaks on war and its aftermath of war, given Vuong's background of having a Vietnamese grandmother and a white American soldier for a grandfather who met during the Vietnam War, and subsequently it draws a portrait and tribute to his lineage, family, and identity. But this collection specifically made me think on how violence and love are intertwined and how life and survival is violent and not necessarily pretty, and yet there are things that remain in life that refuse to be violent in the face of violence, or are still beautiful in spite of their violent nature. Ultimately, I find that this collection depicts the human condition to survive, what we fight for and what we lose, and why we go forward despite of it. The next superlative to be awarded is the longest book I read this year, which is Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. I read the version translated by Pevir and Volokonsky, and what a journey has it been. It's a book that I've always wanted to read and finally got the push this year because I took a random quiz that assigned you a Russian literary character, and I got Anna Karenina, and I wanted to make that judgment for myself to figure out whether or not it was an accurate assignment, so I decided to go ahead and read it. She is definitely modern for her times, and her complexity, or what makes her interesting, I think, is because it's so easy to look at her story and paint her in extremities of whether she's this careless character with no restraint to commit infidelity, or someone who is so tragic because of her fate and is innocent to her whims. But I think my reading of it was more towards how she is human and she makes choices, and she is neither of those two polarities that I think is easy to just caricature her as. The story is ultimately about the reverberations of her actions, and I do walk out of it still just wanting more of her, so she is definitely a titular character in that way, and she is a very impressionable character in that way. Alright, this year I discovered 8 new authors in fiction, and so by new authors, I mean this is my first time reading their work, and I also discovered 5 new poets, though the number for poetry is much higher than that because it only refers to poets who I read through like their entire collection for the first time, and not poets that I encounter through like one-offs or their poems that are published in the journals that I read this year, because it's just much easier for me to tally. Given that, my most read author for fiction this year goes to Mieko Kawakami with 2 books, specifically Heaven and All the Lovers in the Night. True to her word in an interview where she says that a novel should destabilize the reader and create a feeling that you've been able to touch the truth somehow, encapsulates my experience with both of her works. Heaven follows 2 teenagers who are bullied in school, strike an unlikely friendship, and ultimately come to terms with the meaning behind their suffering. While Lovers in the Night follows the journey of a woman in her 30s who is trying to break out of her shell of isolation and has to confront her past cropping up. Both books critiqued societal's way of thinking and the resulting consequence of it in the individual level. Without spoiling too much, for example, Heaven can be read simply as a story that critiques high school bullying culture, but at the same time, I think it is a story that questions one's approach to finding meaning in suffering. Like, does it matter? Or can finding meaning in suffering lead to a passive mentality of acceptance that does more harm than good to the individual? For Lovers in the Night, the majority of the story revolves around three women in particular. One who is past the prime of her age in Japanese society and therefore is considered invisible. Another woman who is labeled as promiscuous, and then you also have another woman in the story who by all means achieves the so-called dream life, considering that she's married, she has kids, and yet she is contemplating how the lack of resources in bringing up a family leads to a drain in her own identity. And although it could be said that the story revolves around commentary on gender, I also think that given there's another character who features heavily in the story as well, the book also calls into question the way that society instills shame and the way that said shame becomes a barrier to our search for human connection and is also what keeps us isolated in society. And I think that's one thing that I really adore from Mieko Kawakami's writings, is how her stories generate these kind of questions in us, well, in me, I suppose, as a reader, and I look forward to more of her work in the next year. I don't know if she has a work coming out next year, but I mean, I'm going to be reading more of her work next year. So that's fiction. For poetry, my most read author is Tracy Brimhall with 3 poetry collections, including Our Lady in Ruins, Saudade, and Come the Slumberless to the Land of Nod. Our Lady of Ruins is a collection set in a dystopian landscape on the brink of a revolution. We deal with faith in gods, the animalistic side of survival, and speaking of animals, there are a lot of animal imagery in this collection, which is very much reminiscent to me, at least while I was reading NBC's Hannibal. Tracy Brimhall has also cited NBC Hannibal as one of her influences, so I think if you enjoy that thin line between beauty and horror, you would enjoy that similar atmosphere and the images portrayed in this particular collection. Saudade, meanwhile, is set in the Brazilian Amazon with historical events from the 1970s intertwined with mythology. So it's a collection reminiscent of magical realism, and if you're looking for a poetry collection that spans or reads like a novel that spans generations or anything that is myth-inspired, I think you would enjoy Saudade. Finally, when it comes to Summerless to the Land of Nod, it is a collection that deals heavily with death and justice, and also the collection out of the 3 that brings forth present events to the front fold. So things like school shootings are mentioned and is the subject of a poem, compared to, say, the fantasy landscape that is Our Lady in Ruins, and also the historical landscape, though not less relevant, from Saudade. Something that I find arresting in the way that she writes is the unapologetic ways in which women own the choices that do not necessarily paint them as a hero, and how it speaks to the innate cruelty that is inherent in all of us. To conclude my literature roundup, I think it would be apt to summarize it in a word or a title of a mood board. I think that word is survival. I encounter a character who is working through their grief from We Are Okay by Nina LaCour, and a character who is on their journey of self-actualization with Clarice Lispector's An Apprenticeship or The Book of Pleasures. Both characters who are in the process of arriving at a point to finally be able to welcome the fullness of life. I also read about an assassin who turns against their emperor in A Ruin of Shadows, and that grittiness of survival is also very much depicted in Our Lady in Ruins as well as The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. Then there are also characters who are grappling with their meaning of existence, like from Mieko Kawakami's Heaven, and also characters who decide to demand more of the life that are handed to them, and so they choose themselves and they insert their agency, like in Ana Karenina. All of them, I think, embody this excerpt from Thanksgiving 2006 by Ocean Vuong that you can definitely find in Night Sky with Exit Wounds, which says, "My mother said I could be anything I wanted, but I chose to live. And I think that encapsulates the spirit of all these characters who are able to stare at the odds that face them and choose to move forward regardless of fear or in spite of fear. Even the characters who are in the process of their grief or is actively working towards something better that they can visualize for themselves is in itself an act of survival, because what is the core of survival but existence? Like Dostoevsky says, I exist. In 1,000 of agonies, I exist. And so what a bold and humble year this has been in literature. Here's to surviving 2024, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.